The smell of wet leather clung to the air when the stranger stepped inside. His boots were scuffed soles frayed, but he carried himself like the shoes had been a disguise. Lyra barely glanced up at first, too busy threading her needle until she caught the glint of his eyes, silver like moonlight on water. He spoke softly with an accent she couldn't place, asking if she could fix them by tomorrow. She promised she would. That night, exhaustion made her clumsy. Filling out his receipt, she absent-mindedly scrawled the words she would never dare say aloud. "Wish I could see you again." It was meant for the scrap pile, but in the morning rush she handed it to him without realizing. The next day he returned, not just with payment, but with a bouquet of lilies. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked. She didn't know then that this was no ordinary man, or that the truth about him would turn her quiet life into a story she'd never believe was her own. But what happens in the end will break every expectation you have. The bell over the cobbler's door let out a thin, tired chime when he walked in. Lyra barely noticed at first. She was bent over a cracked leather satchel, pressing the worn seams together with her thumb as the old sewing machine hummed. The shop smelled as it always did, like polished leather, and the faint sweetness of beeswax from the polished tin. Outside, the drizzle pattered against the window, leaving tiny rivulets down the glass. She only looked up when a shadow lengthened across the counter. The man standing there was tall, at least a head above her, and the boots in his hand told a story of miles walked. Their soles were thin, the stitching along the sides uneven, as if they'd been repaired hastily more than once. And yet, his coat was tailored. The fabric fine enough that she'd never seen its like except in magazines. His dark hair curled slightly where the rain had touched it. "I was told you're the best in town," he said. His voice was low, smooth, and carried the faintest accent. She couldn't place it, though something in her gut told her it wasn't local. "I can fix them," she replied, standing. "But they'll need a night to set after I stitch and re-sole them." "That's fine," he said, placing the boots gently on the counter. He hesitated as though searching for the right words. "Tomorrow evening." She nodded and slid a small pad of receipt paper toward her, noting his name when he gave it Caelan Drake. She spelled it carefully, her penmanship neat from years of writing tiny repair notes. When he left, the bell chimed again, and for a moment the air felt emptier without him in it. Lyra shook her head at herself. It was just a customer, a stranger. That night, after sweeping the dust from the floorboards and locking the front door, she sat in the dim light at the counter to write the receipt. She was tired, her shoulders aching, eyes heavy. Her mind drifted, picturing silver eyes under a rain-dark sky. Before she knew it, beneath the itemized line for Risole and Stitch, she'd written, "Wish I could see you again." She stared at the words. They were nothing, just a thought, a scrap of her loneliness spilling onto paper. Normally, she would toss the slip into the waste pile and start fresh, but the light flickered overhead and she thought, "I'll tear it up in the morning." Morning came too quickly. The shop was busy. 2 men came in arguing over who had been in line first. Mrs. Alden wanted her son's work boots done today, and Lyra's sewing machine jammed twice. When Caelan returned for his boots, she smiled out of habit, slid them into a paper bag, and tucked the receipt inside without thinking. It wasn't until she was sweeping up that evening that she realized what she had done. Her chest tightened. "Oh, no," she whispered into the empty shop. She pressed her hand to her mouth, mortified. The note wasn't meant for anyone's eyes, least of all his. She tried to tell herself he wouldn't notice. Maybe he'd toss the receipt without reading it. But that night, lying in bed in the small room above the shop, the thought gnawed at her. What if he did read it? What if he thought she was ridiculous? Or worse, desperate? The next day, she half expected never to see him again. Yet just after lunch, the bell over the door rang. She looked up and froze. He was there, the boots on his feet, a bouquet of white lilies in one hand. "I came to thank you," he said, his lips curling in a faint smile. "For the work, and for the note." Her stomach flipped. You wrote you'd like to see me again," he continued gently. "Would you take a walk with me?" Lyra stared at him. Part of her wanted to sink behind the counter and never emerge. The other part, the part that had been quietly, stubbornly lonely for years, said yes before she could stop herself. The afternoon air was cool and damp as they walked along the narrow cobblestone streets behind the market. He asked about her work, her late father, the shop she'd inherited. His questions were thoughtful, not prying, and she found herself answering more than she usually would. "You've been here your whole life?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I've never had reason to leave." He nodded as though understanding more than she'd said aloud. At a small cafe, he insisted on buying her coffee. The smell of roasted beans mingled with the rain outside, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt light. They parted at the shop door, and as he walked away, she caught herself hoping, truly, hoping that he would come back. She didn't know then that this small, foolish note had set something in motion, something far bigger than she could imagine. Kaelin came back 2 days later. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to warm the street outside, when the bell above the door chimed. Lyra had been polishing a pair of men's Oxfords, her apron already smudged with brown dye. "You're early," she said, before she could stop herself. He smiled faintly, stepping inside. "I was in the neighborhood." She doubted it. The shop wasn't near anything grand, just a corner of the old market road where grocers sold bruised apples and children kicked a rag ball down the gutter. Still, she poured him a small cup of coffee from the tin pot she kept on the back shelf. He accepted it, gratefully, holding it in both hands as though savoring the warmth. They fell into an easy rhythm that morning she worked. He asked small questions, and between their words there were silences that somehow felt comfortable rather than awkward. Over the next week, he returned twice more. Once with a paper bag of almond pastries, once just to stand by the counter while she repaired a lady's red heels. It became something she anticipated without meaning to. The way his presence made the hours pass faster. The way he seemed to listen not just to her words, but to the spaces between them. One afternoon, as she was restitching the strap of a sandal, Mrs. Holt from the bakery across the street stepped in. Her eyes flicked between Lyra and Kaelin, sharp with curiosity. "Well," Mrs. Holt said, folding her arms, "I see you've got company." Kaelin offered her a polite nod. "Just a customer," Lyra said quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Holt's gaze lingered on him a beat too long before she left. The bell jingled like a warning. After she was gone, Lyra sighed. "She'll have it all over town by evening." "Does that bother you?" Kaelin asked quietly. "No. Yes. I don't know." She kept her eyes on the sandal. "People around here, they like to think they know everyone's business. And they don't forget much either." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll give them nothing worth twisting." But that wasn't entirely true. Because every walk they took along the canal through the park with the iron benches was a small rebellion against the quiet, measured life she'd been living. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, they sat by the river. The water was black and slow, the air smelling faintly of wet stone. "You never talk about yourself," Lyra said, watching the reflection of the lamps in the current. "I do," he said softly. "Just not about certain things." "Like what?" He hesitated, then smiled in that guarded way she was starting to recognize. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." She laughed lightly. "Try me." Instead of answering, he changed the subject, asking if she'd ever seen the city's winter festival. She let it go, though a small seed of curiosity took root. Days later, as she swept the shop near closing, her neighbor Jonah came by. He was in his 40s, a widower who sometimes brought her leftover stew. "I've seen that man with you," Jonah said, leaning against the doorframe. "You should be careful, Lyra. Men who look like that don't walk into places like this without a reason." She frowned. Maybe he just needed his boots fixed. Maybe Jonah said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Or maybe he's looking for something, and you'll be the one to pay for it. After he left, the words stayed with her. That night she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. She thought of Kaelin's hands, calloused, despite the fine way he carried himself. She thought of the way he watched her work, quiet but intent, and she wondered just for a moment if Jonah might be right. The next time Kaelin visited, she told herself she'd ask more questions. But when he stepped through the door with the rain in his hair and 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand, the words slipped away. They spent that afternoon in companionable quiet, her stitching him, reading an old book he'd pulled from the shelf above the counter. It wasn't until he was leaving that she caught the look in his eyes, like someone who carried a weight they couldn't set down. She watched him walk away down the wet street, and her chest ached with something she didn't want to name. She didn't know that the next time she saw that look, it would be under very different circumstances. The rain that evening came down in silver sheets rattling against the shop's old window panes. Lyra was bent over the counter, oiling the crank of her sewing machine, when the sound of tires splashing through puddles caught her ear. She glanced up, expecting to see one of the market's delivery vans rumbling past. Instead, a sleek black car rolled to a slow stop right outside. Its polished sides reflected the street lamps, the drizzle beading like quicksilver on the surface. Her brows knit. No one drove cars like that here. The back door opened, and two men stepped out. They wore dark suits that seemed to repel the rain, their movements sharp and deliberate. A third man emerged behind them, taller, broad-shouldered, the kind of posture you didn't learn unless someone drilled it into you from birth. It was Kalen, only now he wasn't in his simple coat or worn boots. He wore a tailored navy overcoat, the collar turned up against the rain. The men in suits flanked him as if by instinct. The bell over her door chimed when they entered. The taller of the suited men scanned the small shop, his eyes flicking to the back door as if assessing an escape route. Lyra straightened slowly. Kalen, one of the suited men, spoke before he could. "Your Highness, the car is ready." The words landed like a stone in her chest. Her mind struggled to catch up. "Your Highness." She looked at Kalen. He held her gaze, rain dripping from the edge of his coat. There was no hint of denial in his expression. "Lyra," he said softly, as if the sound of her name might steady her. But her heart was thudding too hard to hear much else. "You?" She stopped, glancing at the men beside him. "You're a prince." Crown Prince Kalen of Valberg, the other man supplied crisply, as though delivering a press statement. "He's been traveling ahead of his coronation." The air in the shop seemed to tilt. The smell of leather and polish suddenly felt stifling. "I didn't." She took a step back, her apron brushing the counter. "You never said." "I didn't come here to deceive you," Kalen said, his voice low. "I needed to be somewhere I could be myself, without titles, without the weight of it all." Her mind flashed back to every walk, every coffee, every moment she'd let herself believe they were simply two people finding comfort in each other's company. Now it all felt like a fragile glass that had just shattered in her hands. The man in the suit cleared his throat. "We must go, Your Highness." Kalen hesitated. "I'll return," he told her, the promise thick with something like urgency. "Please, don't shut me out before I can explain." Then he was gone, the bell chiming in his wake. She stood frozen until the car pulled away, its taillights glowing red through the rain. By the time she locked up that night, the whispers had already begun. Mrs. Holt had seen the car. Jonah's voice carried across the street as he told someone in the bakery queue that he'd known the stranger wasn't who he claimed. In the cramped room above her shop, Lyra sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. She could still feel the phantom weight of the lilies he'd once placed there. She'd thought she was cautious with her heart. She'd thought she knew the man who drank coffee at her counter and asked about her father's old tools. Now she wasn't sure she knew anything at all. The next day the shop was quieter than usual, but not for lack of customers. People still came, but they came with sidelong glances, with small smirks, with murmurs they didn't bother to lower when she was within earshot. By midday, Jonah stopped in, shaking his head. "I warned you, Lyra. Men like that, they don't belong in our world, and when they leave, they take a piece of you with them." She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She wanted to believe it herself, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way Kalen had looked at her in that moment, part pleading, part resigned, as if he'd known the truth would drive a wedge between them. That evening she locked the shop early, retreating upstairs as the rain eased into a mist. She tried to lose herself in mending an old jacket, but her thoughts circled endlessly. She wasn't sure which hurt more, the fact that he'd hidden the truth, or the fact that part of her still wanted to believe the man she'd come to know was the same one who'd stood in her doorway. Downstairs, the smell of leather and polish lingered in the dark. And for the first time since her father's death, Lyra felt like a stranger in her own shop. For the next several days, Lyra kept the shop running by muscle memory alone. She swept the floor, she polished boots, she stitched frayed seams until her fingers ached. But her mind was elsewhere, trapped in that moment when the suited man had called Kaelin your highness. It wasn't only the shock, it was the way the air had shifted afterward, thick with judgment.
The whispers grew sharper.
Two young women lingered by the window one morning, pretending to admire the display while snickering. Bet she thought she was going to marry him, one muttered. Or get herself a little palace, the other replied, smirking. Lyra closed the blinds. Jonah came by less often now, but when he did, he wore that expression, half pity, half I told you so. Mrs. Holt, on the other hand, seemed energized by the gossip dropping off bread she couldn't sell just so she could ask, Has His Highness sent for you yet? Each time Lyra answered with silence. Kaelin hadn't returned until the fifth night. The shop was already closed. She was upstairs mending a tear in her father's old coat when she heard the bell downstairs. She froze. The door was locked. Then came a knock, not sharp, but steady. When she opened the door, he stood there in the same simple coat he'd worn the first day they met. No entourage, no polished car, just Kaelin. Lyra, he said, voice low. I didn't want it to happen that way. She stepped aside reluctantly, and he entered. The shop smelled faintly of cedar oil, the only light coming from the small lamp on the counter. You let me believe. She swallowed hard. You let me think you were someone like me. I am someone like you, he said quickly. When I'm here. When I'm with you. She shook her head. You're a Prince Kaelin. Your world is... It's nothing like mine. His jaw tightened. That world isn't everything. I've spent years in it surrounded by people who smile because they have to, who measure every word, every step. I came here to breathe. And then I met you. She looked away, fingers tracing the edge of the counter. Do you know what people are saying about me? That I was chasing a crown? That I thought you'd whisk me away to a palace? His voice softened. I don't care what they say. Well, I do, she said quietly, because I have to live here when you leave. The words hung in the air. He didn't try to argue, only stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. I don't want to leave without knowing there's still a chance for us. Let me show you my world, not as an obligation, but as an invitation. She let out a small, humorless laugh. You think one trip to your palace will fix this? I think he said that if you saw it, you might understand me better, and maybe understand that I'm not asking you to change who you are. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man who had walked with her through rain-slick streets was the same one who stood in glittering halls. But she also knew that stepping into his world would mean stepping into its judgment, its rules, its expectations. I'll think about it, she said finally. He nodded as if accepting that was all he could ask for tonight. After he left, she stood in the quiet shop, the rain tapping lightly against the glass. Her heart ached with the knowledge that she was already leaning toward yes. The next morning, Jonah caught her on the street. Saw your prince last night, he said. Just remember, stories like this don't end the way they do in books. Lyra looked at him steadily. Maybe not, but sometimes they don't have to end at all. She walked away before he could reply, her mindset on a decision she wasn't ready to admit aloud. Because part of her already knew sooner or later she was going to see Kaelin's world for herself. The invitation came in the form of a letter. Not sealed in wax, not gilded, just plain ivory paper folded once her name written in a hand she knew by heart. Lyra found it tucked under the shop door one early morning. She turned it over in her hands, half afraid to open it, half afraid not to. Inside, the words were simple. The car will come for you tomorrow at 9. Please say yes. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat at her small window, watching the market lanterns fade into the dark, thinking of her father, how he'd once told her the world beyond their street was vast and unforgiving. Morning came grey and cool. When the black car pulled up outside, she hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping in. The ride took them beyond the narrow streets, past fields, heavy with mist, into hills, where the air felt different, crisper, almost expectant. When they reached the gates of the Valberg estate, she understood why Kaelin had struggled to bridge their worlds. The palace was carved from pale stone, its windows glinting in the sun gardens, spilling over with blooms she couldn't name. Servants moved quietly along the gravel paths. Kalen was waiting at the entrance, dressed simply, though the setting made even the simplest clothes look like part of a portrait. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm not staying," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. He smiled faintly, offering his arm. "Then let me make the most of the time we have." He led her through the halls, paintings of kings and queens, staring down the air, smelling faintly of polished wood and roses. In the library, he showed her a pair of boots displayed in a glass case. "They were my father's," he explained, "worn on the day he signed the treaty that ended our longest war. A cobbler repaired them the night before so they'd be strong enough to last." Lyra traced the glass with her fingertips. "You brought me here to show me boots?" "To show you," he said softly, "that your work, the life you think is small, can leave marks on history. They ended up in the gardens where the lilies grew taller than her waist." She remembered the first bouquet he'd brought her, how out of place it had seemed in her little shop. "You could have anyone," she said suddenly. "Why me?" "Because you never wanted anything from me but my company," he replied. "Because when I sat in your shop, I was just a man with worn boots, and you looked at me like that was enough." Her chest ached. "And if I said yes, if I stepped into this world, then I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted it." She was quiet for a long time. The lilies swayed in the breeze, their scent heady in the warm air. Finally, she said, "I don't know if I can be a princess, but I know I want to see where this goes." The relief in his expression was almost boyish. Weeks later, the gossip in the market changed. Mrs. Holt still pried for details, but now with a hint of approval. Jonah admitted grudgingly that maybe he'd been wrong. And Lyra? She kept mending boots even as she spent more and more days in Valberg. Because the note she'd once scribbled without thinking had not just reached its reader, it had rewritten her life. And every time she saw Kalen walk into her shop, silver eyes catching the light, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the smallest slip, a single line on a scrap of paper, can open a door you never knew was there. Lyra thought her world ended at the edge of the market road, but love, honesty, and a little courage proved otherwise. Have you ever had a moment where one small choice changed everything? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for staying till the end. I'll see you in the next story.